When did something as simple as ground beef between bread become so? American? Was it always destined to represent our entire culture to the world? And how did a food with such mysterious origins end up on nearly every street corner from coast to coast? Honestly, you'd expect clearer answers for something so central to our dining culture, but hamburger history turns out to be surprisingly slippery, full of gaps and contradictions that have left food scholars debating for generations. The path ahead will reveal why this particular mystery has stumped food historians for decades, and by the time we're done wandering through these culinary shadows, maybe you'll find your thoughts growing as soft and hazy as the origins we're chasing, letting the day's sharp edges blur into something gentler. Before we dive in, if this kind of sleepy historical wandering appeals to you, consider subscribing to join us for more quiet journeys through America's food mysteries. And drop a comment about what time it is where you're listening. I'm always curious about the different corners of the world where these stories find their way to sleepy ears. Now, settle back into your pillows. Maybe adjust that blanket to just the right weight, and let's begin this gentle exploration of one of history's most deliciously elusive puzzles. The problem with hamburger history is that there really isn't much reliable hamburger history to speak of. You'd think something so fundamental to American culture would have left a clearer trail, but food historians find themselves chasing shadows and half-remembered stories that seem to dissolve the moment you examine them closely. What we do know is that massive waves of German immigrants arrived in America throughout the mid-1800s. Between 1850 and 1890, over 4 million Germans crossed the Atlantic, bringing with them centuries of butchering traditions, sausage-making techniques, and various ways of preparing chopped and seasoned beef. These weren't just random settlers. These were skilled craftsmen, many of whom had spent generations perfecting their understanding of meat. But here's where the trail goes cold. The leap from German butchering traditions to the American hamburger isn't nearly as straightforward as most food origin stories would have you believe. Yes, the port city of Hamburg had something called Hamburg steak, a dish of chopped raw beef that was seasoned and served without bread. And yes, German immigrants certainly knew how to work with ground meat in ways that many Americans hadn't yet mastered. However, and this is where honest food historians start hedging their bets, the direct connection between these German traditions and what we now call a hamburger remains largely speculative. It's one of those logical assumptions that sounds perfectly reasonable until you start looking for actual evidence. I find it fascinating that we're so eager to create neat origin stories, even when the historical record refuses to cooperate. The truth is, countless immigrant groups were experimenting with ground meat preparations throughout this period. Germans weren't the only ones who understood that chopped beef could be seasoned, shaped, and cooked in appealing ways. What's more documented is the broader context of American eating habits during this time. The country was urbanizing rapidly. Factory work was creating new demands for quick, portable meals, and traditional cooking methods were adapting to accommodate busier lifestyles. Ground meat fit perfectly into this evolving food landscape, regardless of whether it came from Hamburg or anywhere else. The meat grinding technology itself tells a more reliable story. In the 1870s and 1880s, mechanical meat grinders became widely available in American butcher shops and eventually in home kitchens. This wasn't revolutionary technology, but it did make ground meat preparation more accessible to ordinary cooks who might not have had the knife skills or time for hand chopping. Refrigerated railroad cars, another crucial development of this era, meant that fresh meat could travel longer distances without spoiling. Suddenly, cities that were hundreds of miles from cattle ranches could enjoy relatively fresh ground beef, opening up possibilities that simply hadn't existed a generation earlier. But even with these technological advances, we still can't point to a specific moment when someone said, "I'm going to put this ground beef between two pieces of bread and call it a hamburger." The transition seems to have happened gradually, organically, without anyone thinking they were creating something historically significant. Some food scholars suggest, and this is where we enter the realm of educated speculation, that the hamburger might have emerged from multiple culinary traditions simultaneously. German chopped beef preparations, English sandwich culture, American frontier practicality, all converging in the bustling food landscape of late 19th century America. What strikes me as most honest about this uncertainty is how it reflects the messy, collaborative nature of food evolution. Dishes rarely spring fully formed from a single inventor's imagination. They emerge from countless small experiments, cultural exchanges, and practical adaptations that leave few traces in the historical record. The Hamburg connection, for all its logical appeal, might be less important than we've assumed. After all, humans have been chopping meat and putting it between bread in various forms for centuries. The specific combination we call a hamburger might have been inevitable once the right technological and cultural conditions aligned. By the 1880s, American cities were full of people who needed quick, affordable, portable meals. They had access to mechanical meat grinders, relatively fresh ground beef, and a growing familiarity with sandwich-style eating. Whether the inspiration came from Hamburg steak, immigrant traditions, or simple necessity, the hamburger was waiting to be discovered. And perhaps that's the most intriguing part of this mystery. The hamburger didn't need a single inventor or a dramatic moment of creation. It needed only the right circumstances, and those circumstances were building throughout the mid-1800s, creating the perfect storm for America's most iconic food to emerge from the historical fog. As we'll see, the lack of clear origins hasn't stopped dozens of people from claiming credit for this culinary revolution. But first, we needed to understand why the hamburger's birth certificate remains so frustratingly blank, leaving us with more questions than answers about how this simple sandwich came to define a nation's appetite. The sandwich revolution that swept through America in the 1860s and 1870s wasn't really about the Earl of Sandwich at all. While popular folklore claims that John Montague invented the concept in 1762 during marathon card games, the reality is that Americans were already discovering their own reasons to put meat between bread. And those reasons had everything to do with the demands of industrial life. What we can document with certainty is that American factory production exploded during this period. Government census records show that manufacturing establishments grew dramatically between 1860 and 1880, creating millions of jobs that required workers to eat quickly, efficiently, and often while standing at their machines or walking between job sites. By the time ground beef started appearing in American kitchens, the country had already embraced a completely new way of thinking about meals. You can trace this shift through the factory schedules of the era. Workers needed food that could be eaten without utensils, often in environments where sitting down for a proper meal simply wasn't possible. The timing was perfect for what records from the period describe as rapid changes in urban eating patterns, though contemporary accounts suggest this happened more out of necessity than any conscious cultural movement. Factory owners wanted minimal meal breaks. Workers wanted maximum nutrition in minimum time, and the sandwich format solved both problems simultaneously. Here's where it gets interesting, and this is something that often surprises people when they dig into the historical record. American sandwich culture developed very differently from its supposed English origins. While European accounts describe sandwiches as refined snacks for the leisure class, American newspapers from the 1860s show them being sold by street vendors, packed in workers' lunch pails, and eaten in environments that would have horrified aristocratic dining traditions. Food historians continue to debate whether American sandwich culture emerged independently or was genuinely influenced by English dining customs. Some scholars argue that the timing of sandwich adoption in industrial cities suggests a purely practical American innovation, while others point to documented English cultural influences in American dining during this period, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The real breakthrough came with mobile food vendors, who began appearing in American cities during the 1870s. Contemporary records describe these entrepreneurs selling various meat and bread combinations from pushcarts, creating what we might recognize today as the first quick-service food experience, where customers could walk up, order a hot meal, and continue with their day. I find it remarkable how little attention these vendors received from food writers of the time, yet they were quietly revolutionizing American eating habits. They created something entirely new, a dining experience based on speed and convenience rather than ceremony or social interaction, something that would have been almost unthinkable just a generation earlier. The ground meat connection becomes clearer when you examine the practical challenges these vendors faced. Sliced roast beef was expensive and spoiled quickly in pre-refrigeration America. Cheese required ice that most small operations couldn't afford, but ground meat could be purchased cheaply from local butchers, seasoned to enhance flavor, and cooked thoroughly to ensure safety. Contemporary food writers were already expressing mixed feelings about these developments. Period publications include warnings about the uncertain quality of street food preparations, while simultaneously acknowledging that these vendors were feeding thousands of workers who had few other affordable options for midday meals. A tension that reveals the complex social changes of the era. The Civil War had accelerated these changes in unexpected ways. Veterans returning from military service had grown accustomed to portable, practical meals that could be eaten without ceremony. Military commissaries had experimented with various preserved meat preparations, and soldiers brought these utilitarian eating habits back to civilian life, creating a ready market for quick, hearty sandwiches that prioritized function over form. But here's the quirky detail that most food histories overlook. The early ground meat sandwiches served by street vendors weren't necessarily beef at all. Contemporary accounts suggest that pork, mutton, and even mixed meats were equally common in these early chopped meat preparations. The specific focus on beef developed gradually, driven partly by cattle industry growth and partly by evolving American taste preferences that were still taking shape. What's fascinating about this period is how the infrastructure for hamburger culture was assembling piece by piece without anyone recognizing the bigger picture. The sandwich format had solved the portability problem. Street vendors had proved that hot, made-to-order meals could be profitable, and mechanical meat grinders were making ground meat preparation accessible to small-scale food entrepreneurs. Each element seemed unremarkable on its own. Workers had always needed to eat. Vendors had always sold food, and butchers had always ground meat for sausages. But the combination of industrial work schedules, urban density, and mechanical innovation was creating something unprecedented in food history, though nobody at the time would have described it in such grand terms. By 1880, you could walk through any major American city and find entrepreneurs selling hot ground meat sandwiches from mobile carts or small storefronts. The concept was there. The customer base was established. The technology was available. All that remained was for someone to standardize the process, give it a memorable name, and turn it into a systematic business model. The sandwich revolution had prepared America for the hamburger, even though nobody at the time would have used that word to describe what they were eating. They were simply participating in a quiet transformation of American dining culture, one that would eventually create the foundation for the country's most recognizable culinary export, without anyone suspecting they were making history. What strikes me most about this period is how ordinary it must have seemed to the people living through it. They were just trying to eat efficiently in an increasingly fast-paced world, unknowingly creating the conditions that would make the hamburger not just possible, but inevitable, one practical meal at a time. Now we arrive at the most entertaining chapter in hamburger history, the great invention myth that has turned a simple food into a battleground of American folklore. You'd think that something as straightforward as putting ground beef between bread would have a clear creator, but instead we get a delicious tangle of tall tales, suspicious timing, and the kind of hometown pride that can turn a county fair legend into a tourist attraction. The mythology factory really hit its stride in the early 20th century, decades after these supposed inventions had taken place. This timing tells us everything we need to know. By then, hamburgers had become profitable enough that claiming credit was worth constructing elaborate backstories, complete with heroic teenagers, dramatic moments of inspiration, and suspiciously perfect details that read like American dream fairy tales. Let's start with Charlie Negreen of Seymour, Wisconsin, whose family claimed he invented the hamburger in 1885 at the tender age of 15. According to the legend, young Charlie was selling meatballs at a county fair when customers complained they couldn't walk around while eating. So he supposedly flattened the meatballs, slapped them between two slices of bread, named the creation after Hamburg steak, and single-handedly launched America's most iconic food. The story has everything you could want from an origin myth: a plucky teenager solving problems with Yankee ingenuity, a county fair representing democratic American gathering, instant recognition of genius. It's almost too perfect, which is exactly the problem that makes food historians squirm uncomfortably in their chairs. Here's the quirky detail that often gets overlooked in the Negreen story. The family claimed Charlie called his creation a hamburger in 1885. But documented evidence shows that the word hamburger wasn't commonly used in American English until the 1890s. It's like claiming someone invented the internet in 1950. The terminology simply didn't exist yet in the way the story suggests. Food historians continue to debate whether any of these individual invention stories have merit, or whether they represent what scholars diplomatically call collective false memory creation. The evidence strongly suggests that ground beef sandwiches emerged gradually from multiple sources, but that conclusion doesn't satisfy our cultural hunger for clear heroes and dramatic eureka moments. Then there's the Menchess brothers saga from Hamburg, New York. Frank and Charles Menchess, who supposedly invented the hamburger in 1885 when they ran out of sausage meat at the Erie County Fair. Their story follows a similar pattern: practical problem, instant solution, immediate recognition of brilliance, and conveniently, a town name that seems to explain the hamburger terminology. I have to admire the narrative efficiency of these stories, but what strikes me as most revealing is how they all emerged publicly in the 1950s and 1960s, exactly when small American towns were discovering the tourism potential of claiming famous food origins. Suddenly, hamburger invention stories were popping up like dandelions after rain. What we can document with certainty is far more interesting than any single invention tale. The earliest reliable mentions of hamburger sandwiches in American newspapers appear in the 1890s, not as revolutionary new foods, but as menu items that seem already familiar to readers. A Chicago Tribune advertisement from 1894 lists hamburger steaks alongside other standard offerings, suggesting this was already an established food category. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair provides our best documented early hamburger moment. Multiple vendors were serving ground beef sandwiches to fairgoers, though exactly who was first remains gloriously unclear. What's fascinating is that fair newspapers described these as popular attractions, not as startling innovations. Visitors seemed to know exactly what they were ordering. Here's where the evidence gets genuinely intriguing. Early hamburger vendors weren't trying to invent anything revolutionary. They were simply adapting existing German and American meat preparations to the practical demands of quick service dining. The invention was really more of a recognition that this particular combination of familiar elements worked better than other options for busy urban customers. Contemporary accounts from the 1890s reveal that ground beef sandwiches were appearing simultaneously in cities across the country. New York lunch carts were serving them. Chicago vendors offered them. Philadelphia establishments advertised them. This geographic spread suggests organic evolution rather than diffusion from a single source. What's most amusing about the competing invention stories is how they've created their own secondary mythology. Towns now compete annually for hamburger recognition. Seymour, Wisconsin hosts Hamburger Charlie Day. Hamburg, New York celebrates the Menchess brothers. Athens, Texas claims Louis Lassen. It's become a cottage industry of culinary patriotism. The scholarly consensus, such as it exists among food historians who study these things, suggests that hamburgers emerged from the intersection of German butchering traditions, American sandwich culture, and urban quick-service dining needs. The invention probably happened dozens of times independently, as practical food vendors discovered that ground beef sandwiches satisfied hungry customers efficiently and profitably. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that hamburgers weren't invented so much as they were discovered. Like any successful food combination, they emerged when existing ingredients, techniques, and social needs aligned perfectly. The fact that we can identify a single inventor might actually be the most authentically American thing about the whole story. What I find most charming about this mythological muddle is how it reflects our deep cultural need for origin stories that celebrate individual innovation. We want our hamburgers to have a hero, even if the reality is messier and more collaborative than any single dramatic moment could provide. The various invention tales have become part of hamburger folklore, and perhaps that's more valuable than historical accuracy for understanding how this simple sandwich became embedded so deeply in American identity that dozens of communities felt compelled to claim credit for creating it. After wading through all those colorful invention myths, it's refreshing to finally encounter some actual documentary evidence. The 1890s and early 1900s represent the first time we can point to real newspaper clippings, actual menu listings, and written records that prove hamburgers were transitioning from street food curiosity to established American dining option, though the evidence comes with its own fascinating surprises. The earliest confirmed references to hamburger-style sandwiches in American newspapers begin appearing in the mid-1890s, where local restaurants advertised Hamburg steak sandwiches alongside other standard fare. What's significant isn't just these mentions, but how casually they appear, suggesting readers already knew what they were ordering without needing detailed explanations. Contemporary newspaper advertisements from the period show restaurants still experimenting with the best way to present this relatively new menu item. Some establishments offered Hamburg steak on toast. Others promoted chopped beef served between slices of bread, indicating that the format was still evolving even as the basic concept gained acceptance. You can trace the gradual standardization of hamburger terminology through these early written sources. Hamburg steak sandwiches, hamburger steaks on bread, chopped beef sandwiches. The language was slowly settling into the familiar form we recognize today, but the food itself was clearly gaining popularity across different regions simultaneously, without any central coordination or marketing campaign. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair provides our most detailed early documentation of hamburger culture in full swing. Multiple vendors were serving what contemporary accounts describe as hamburger sandwiches to fairgoers, and newspaper coverage from the event shows long lines of customers who seemed entirely familiar with what they were ordering. This wasn't experimental cuisine anymore. It was established comfort food. Here's the quirky detail that often gets overlooked in World's Fair accounts. Food service records from the event show that hamburger vendors were going through massive quantities of ground beef daily, but they were also among the fair's biggest consumers of onions, pickles, and what the records mysteriously list as special seasoning compounds, suggesting that even in 1904, vendors were already competing on flavor profiles rather than basic novelty. Food historians have noted that the fair's hamburger vendors weren't trying to educate customers about a new food concept. They were competing on quality, price, and taste, indicating the basic hamburger had already become standardized enough that variations in preparation mattered more than fundamental innovation. Contemporary fairgoers were writing home about which vendor had the best hamburgers, not about discovering hamburgers for the first time. I find it remarkable how the written evidence suggests hamburgers spread organically rather than through any coordinated promotion. Period newspapers from cities as distant as the West Coast and New England begin mentioning hamburger sandwiches around the same time, implying either impossibly rapid cultural diffusion or, more likely, simultaneous development in multiple urban markets facing similar dining demands. The early menu evidence reveals fascinating regional variations that would later disappear as hamburgers became more standardized. Western establishments often included fresh vegetables from the beginning. Midwestern versions frequently featured locally popular pickles and onions. Eastern preparations sometimes incorporated regional spice preferences. These variations show hamburgers adapting to local tastes even as they spread nationally. Restaurant trade publications from this period offer glimpses into how food service professionals viewed this emerging menu category. Contemporary articles advised restaurant owners that chopped beef sandwiches were becoming popular with working-class customers who wanted substantial food that can be eaten efficiently. Recognizing the practical advantages that were driving demand more than any culinary trend. What's particularly revealing about these early documentary sources is how consistently they describe hamburgers as solutions to dining problems rather than gastronomic innovations. The focus was always on convenience, affordability, and satisfaction, suggesting that hamburgers succeeded because they met genuine needs rather than because they represented culinary creativity or sophisticated marketing. Scholars continue to debate whether the rapid appearance of hamburger references in newspapers across different regions represents cultural diffusion from a single source or independent development in multiple locations. The geographic distribution and timing of early mentions suggests the latter, with hamburgers emerging simultaneously in cities that had limited communication during this period, like a practical idea whose time had simply arrived. The advertising language used in these early newspaper mentions provides insight into how restaurants positioned hamburgers to potential customers. Most emphasized practical benefits: quick lunch, substantial meal, economical and satisfying, rather than taste or novelty, indicating that hamburgers were being marketed to busy working people rather than adventurous diners seeking culinary excitement. By the early 1900s, hamburger sandwiches had achieved enough cultural recognition that references to them were appearing in newspaper humor columns and popular entertainment. Period comedy pieces joke about customers asking for hamburgers with actual meat in them, suggesting that quality and authenticity were already becoming concerns as the food gained mainstream popularity and commercial success. The documentary evidence from this period paints a picture of hamburgers evolving from experimental street food to established menu category in roughly a decade. The transition seems to have happened through practical adoption rather than dramatic invention, with countless small food service operators discovering independently that ground beef sandwiches satisfied customers efficiently, profitably, and repeatedly. What emerges from these early written records is a sense of hamburgers finding their natural place in American dining culture through pure utility rather than promotion. They weren't imposed from above by celebrity chefs or driven by elaborate marketing campaigns. They succeeded because they solved real problems for real people and left enough documentary traces for us to finally separate historical fact from the colorful folklore that would later surround their origins. By the early 1900s, hamburgers had moved beyond newspaper advertisements and county fair novelties to become a genuine urban phenomenon. The real action was happening on the streets of America's busiest cities, where a new breed of food entrepreneur was discovering that mobility, speed, and a good understanding of human hunger could transform a simple sandwich into something approaching a small empire on wheels. The lunch wagon represented the first systematic approach to hamburger commerce. These weren't the gleaming food trucks we might imagine today, but practical wooden structures on wheels that could be positioned near factories, office buildings, and transportation hubs where hungry workers gathered predictably throughout the day. What made them revolutionary wasn't just their mobility, but their operators' intuitive grasp of efficiency and customer psychology. Contemporary accounts from major cities describe lunch wagons becoming increasingly common during this period, each serving what their hand-painted signs advertised as hamburg sandwiches or chopped beef on bread. The operators had stumbled upon something that restaurant owners were slower to recognize: that workers would pay premium prices for food that saved them time and eliminated the social complexity of sit-down dining. Here's what strikes me as particularly clever about these early lunch wagon operators. They understood that location mattered more than ambience. A wagon positioned outside a factory gate at lunchtime could serve more customers in an hour than a restaurant served all day, and without the overhead costs of rent, formal dining rooms, or wait staff. It was pure practical wisdom applied to sandwich distribution, though nobody at the time would have used such fancy business terminology. The economics were compelling enough to attract serious entrepreneurs. Period accounts suggest that successful lunch wagon operators could earn respectable livings, despite working with minimal equipment and simple ingredients. The key was understanding exactly what their customers needed from a midday meal, which turned out to be protein, satisfaction, and speed above all else, with friendly service as a welcome bonus. Food historians continue to debate whether the lunch wagon phenomenon developed independently in different cities or spread through some form of cultural transmission between mobile food entrepreneurs. What's clear is that lunch wagon menus became remarkably standardized across regions, featuring ground beef sandwiches, coffee, and perhaps pie or cake for dessert, suggesting either rapid idea sharing or simply practical convergence on what worked best. The lunch wagon phenomenon also solved a crucial problem in early hamburger culture: consistency. Unlike street vendors cooking over unpredictable open fires or small restaurants with varying standards, successful lunch wagon operators developed systematic approaches to meat preparation, cooking times, and sandwich assembly that ensured customers received essentially the same satisfying experience every visit. What's fascinating about this period is how quickly lunch wagon hamburgers developed their own cultural identity distinct from restaurant dining. Workers began referring to wagon food as a category, and the relationship between operators and regular customers took on an almost neighborly quality. It was becoming a community-based business model built on daily repeated interactions and mutual recognition. I find it remarkable how these mobile operators essentially invented customer loyalty programs decades before marketing experts gave them official names. Regular customers developed personal relationships with their preferred wagon operators, who remembered not just sandwich preferences, but family news, work complaints, and local gossip. The hamburger was becoming a social institution as much as a meal. During this period, lunch wagons began attracting regulatory attention from municipal governments. Cities started requiring licenses, health inspections, and designated parking areas. Recognition that these mobile food operations had evolved from temporary street vendors into permanent fixtures of urban dining infrastructure, though the regulations were generally light-handed and supportive. The lunch wagon operators faced unique challenges that restaurant owners never encountered. They had to maintain food safety without running water, store ingredients in minimal space, and serve customers quickly enough to handle the concentrated rush of factory lunch breaks. These constraints led to clever innovations in portable cooking equipment, food storage methods, and service systems that would influence food service for generations. Here's the delightful detail that often gets overlooked in lunch wagon histories. Many operators developed elaborate mental systems for remembering customer preferences without writing anything down. Regular customers could approach a wagon, receive their usual order with perhaps a friendly greeting about the weather, and complete the transaction with the easy familiarity of neighbors. It was personalized service, powered entirely by human memory and genuine care. Contemporary accounts suggest that the most successful lunch wagon hamburgers weren't necessarily the most elaborate, but the most reliable and welcoming. Workers valued knowing exactly what they would receive, how long it would take, and that they'd be greeted as familiar faces rather than anonymous customers. Predictability and personal connection became key ingredients in hamburger success, perhaps more important than culinary innovation. The lunch wagon era established cultural patterns that would define American hamburger culture for decades. The association with honest working-class dining, the emphasis on efficiency without sacrificing friendliness, the expectation of consistent quality, and the idea that hamburgers were fundamentally about nourishment and human connection rather than culinary sophistication. These mobile operators were creating emotional foundations that would make later systematized approaches both familiar and trusted. By the end of this period, lunch wagons had demonstrated that hamburgers could support serious business enterprises, serve thousands of customers, and create genuine community connections in the midst of increasingly impersonal urban environments. The lunch wagon had proved both the commercial viability and the social value of the hamburger, setting the stage for entrepreneurs who would scale these intimate human insights into America's first fast food empires. What's most impressive about the lunch wagon phenomenon is how these small-scale operators collectively figured out that food service was really about human service. They understood that feeding people well involved more than cooking. It required attention to timing, location, consistency, and genuine care for customers as individuals rather than transactions, lessons that would prove timeless in the food industry. In 1921, two men in Wichita, Kansas had an idea that would change American dining forever. Walter Anderson and Billy Ingram weren't trying to revolutionize food culture. They were simply trying to solve a problem that every hamburger vendor faced: how to serve more customers, more consistently, with better quality control than anyone had managed before. What they created instead was the blueprint for fast food as we know it today. Walter Anderson had been operating a small hamburger stand since 1916, serving what he called White Castle hamburgers from a tiny location on South St. Francis Street. His burgers were small, thin, and cooked quickly on a griddle. But what set them apart wasn't size or speed. It was Anderson's obsession with consistency and cleanliness. Every burger was supposed to be identical, every cooking time precisely measured, every ingredient carefully standardized. The problem was scale. Anderson could maintain his exacting standards when he was personally cooking every burger, but he dreamed of expansion that would require other people to replicate his exact methods. This is where Billy Ingram entered the picture, a real estate and insurance man who saw the business potential in Anderson's systematic approach to hamburger preparation. Their 1921 partnership created something unprecedented in American food service. The first restaurant chain built entirely around systematic standardization. This wasn't just about making hamburgers. It was about creating a completely controlled dining experience that could be replicated identically in multiple locations, with the same ingredients, the same cooking methods, the same service protocols, and crucially, the same customer expectations. Here's what strikes me as brilliant about their approach. Anderson and Ingram understood that Americans were becoming increasingly mobile, traveling between cities for work and pleasure in ways that previous generations hadn't. If you could create an identical dining experience in every location, customers would know exactly what to expect whether they were in Wichita, Topeka, or eventually anywhere in the country. The White Castle system was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond hamburgers. They developed standardized building designs that were instantly recognizable, uniform employee training programs, centralized purchasing systems that ensured ingredient consistency, and detailed operational manuals that specified everything from cooking times to customer greeting procedures. It was industrial efficiency applied to food service, decades before anyone called it fast food. Food historians have noted that White Castle's success wasn't just about better hamburgers, though their thin, steam-grilled patties with onions did develop a devoted following. The real innovation was creating a business model that could guarantee customers the same experience regardless of location or individual employee performance, something that had never been achieved in food service before. What's fascinating about the early White Castle expansion is how systematically they approached each new market. They didn't just open restaurants randomly. They studied traffic patterns, worker populations, and local dining habits before selecting locations. Each new White Castle was positioned to serve the same customer base that had made the concept successful in Wichita: urban workers who valued speed, consistency, and reasonable prices above culinary adventure. I find it remarkable how White Castle anticipated so many elements of modern franchise operations, even though they maintained direct ownership of their locations rather than selling franchises. They created standardized training programs, developed uniform supplier relationships, established quality control systems, and built brand recognition that transcended individual restaurant locations. They were essentially inventing corporate chain management, one small hamburger at a time. The architectural element of White Castle deserves special attention. Their distinctive white buildings with castle-like turrets weren't just whimsical design choices. They were carefully calculated marketing tools designed to convey cleanliness, permanence, and respectability. At a time when many hamburger vendors operated from questionable carts or shabby storefronts, White Castle's gleaming white building suggested that fast food could be both convenient and trustworthy. Contemporary business records show that White Castle's systematic approach paid off handsomely during the 1920s. They expanded from their original Wichita location to operate dozens of restaurants across the Midwest, serving millions of hamburgers annually, and generating profits that demonstrated the commercial viability of standardized fast food operations on a scale that had never been attempted before. Scholars continue to debate whether White Castle's influence on American dining culture was ultimately positive or negative, with some arguing that their standardization model sacrificed culinary creativity and local food traditions for efficiency and profit, while others contend that they democratized restaurant dining by making consistent, affordable meals available to working-class Americans who had previously been excluded from most restaurant experiences. What's undeniable is that White Castle created the template that virtually every subsequent fast food chain would follow. The emphasis on speed and efficiency, the focus on limited menus executed consistently, the recognition that branding and visual identity could drive customer loyalty. The understanding that systematic operations could overcome the limitations of individual locations or employees. All of these insights originated with Anderson and Ingram's hamburger experiment in Kansas. Here's the quirky detail that often gets overlooked in White Castle histories. They were among the first restaurants to actively court female customers, designing their interiors to feel safe and respectable for women dining alone or with children. This wasn't just progressive social policy. It was smart business strategy that effectively doubled their potential customer base during an era when most fast food establishments catered primarily to male workers. The White Castle phenomenon also demonstrated something crucial about American consumer psychology, that people would choose familiarity over variety if the familiar option was reliable, convenient, and reasonably priced. This insight would prove prophetic as the American economy became increasingly mobile and standardized throughout the 20th century, creating perfect conditions for the fast food empire that White Castle had pioneered. By 1930, White Castle had proven that hamburgers could support not just individual restaurants or local chains, but entire corporate enterprises with systematic operations spanning multiple states. They had transformed the hamburger from street food curiosity to the foundation of America's first truly modern fast food business, creating a model that would eventually reshape dining culture far beyond their original Kansas origins. The 1920s and 1930s brought something entirely new to the American landscape: roads that seemed to stretch endlessly toward horizons filled with possibility. As automobiles became affordable for ordinary families, a remarkable transformation began taking place along every highway, main street, and country road in America. Suddenly, anywhere there was a place to park a car, there was potential for a hamburger stand, and entrepreneurs across the country began to realize that mobility meant opportunity. The roadside hamburger stand became as much a part of American travel as gas stations and motor courts, each one competing for the attention of drivers who might never pass this way again, but who needed to eat, wanted to eat quickly, and were willing to try whatever looked clean, appealing, and convenient. It was a perfect storm of American capitalism meeting American wanderlust, with hamburgers serving as the delicious common denominator. What's remarkable about this period is how creative these roadside operators became in attracting customers who had essentially unlimited dining choices. You'd see stands shaped like giant hamburgers, others featuring elaborate neon signs visible for miles, some offering curb service where uniformed car hops would bring your food directly to your automobile. The hamburger wasn't just food anymore. It was becoming entertainment, spectacle, and a crucial part of the American road trip experience. Contemporary travel guides from the 1930s describe a landscape dotted with hundreds of small hamburger establishments, each trying to distinguish itself from the competition through unique architecture, catchy names, or special preparation methods. Mom's Burgers, Big Boy Hamburgers, White Tower, Crystal. The names themselves tell the story of entrepreneurs trying to create memorable identities in an increasingly crowded market. I find it fascinating how this period represents perhaps the most democratic moment in hamburger history. Anyone with a small amount of capital, a good location, and decent cooking skills could open a hamburger stand and potentially build a successful business. The barriers to entry were low, the customer base was constantly moving, and the appetite for convenient road food seemed inexhaustible. The automobile culture created entirely new dining behaviors that these roadside stands had to accommodate. Customers wanted to eat in their cars. Families needed kid-friendly options. Travelers required quick service that wouldn't significantly delay their journeys, and everyone wanted food that could be consumed safely while driving. Hamburgers, with their convenient handheld format and satisfying protein content, seemed designed for this new mobile lifestyle. Here's what strikes me as particularly clever about the successful roadside operators. They understood that location was everything, but location wasn't just about high traffic. It was about timing, visibility, and convenience. The best hamburger stands position themselves where hungry travelers would be most receptive to stopping, near tourist attractions, at the edges of towns, or along stretches of highway where the next dining option might be 50 miles away. Food historians have noted that this period saw the development of many hamburger preparation techniques that would become standard throughout the industry. Drive-in operators pioneered faster cooking methods, experimented with different bun styles, developed efficient assembly line preparation systems and created standardized portion sizes that balance customer satisfaction with profit margins. Innovation was driven by necessity, competition, and the constant pressure to serve more customers more quickly. The roadside hamburger phenomenon also democratized restaurant dining in ways that traditional establishments couldn't match. These stands served customers regardless of social class, fashion sense, or dining etiquette. The only requirements were hunger and the ability to pay, making restaurant-style food accessible to Americans who might never have felt comfortable in formal dining establishments. Regional variations flourished during this period in ways that would later disappear as national chains standardized hamburger culture. West Coast stands often featured fresh vegetables and health-conscious options. Southern establishments developed spicier seasonings and regional sauce variations. Midwestern operators focused on hearty portions and traditional preparations. Each region was essentially creating its own hamburger subculture within the broader American phenomenon. What's most impressive about the roadside hamburger boom is how it created an entire industry almost overnight. By the late 1930s, thousands of hamburger stands were operating across the country, employing tens of thousands of workers, serving millions of customers annually, and generating substantial local tax revenues. The hamburger had become a significant economic force, driven entirely by small-scale entrepreneurship and American mobility. Contemporary observers noted that roadside hamburger stands were creating their own social culture, becoming gathering places for teenagers, meeting spots for travelers, and informal community centers in small towns. The hamburger stand was evolving beyond simple food service into a social institution that reflected and shaped American values around mobility, informality, and democratic dining. Scholars continue to debate whether this golden age of roadside hamburger diversity represented the peak of American food entrepreneurship or simply a chaotic transitional period before the inevitable consolidation that would come with national franchising. What's undisputed is that this era established hamburgers as the quintessential American road food, creating cultural associations between hamburgers and freedom, travel, and the open road that persists today. The roadside hamburger explosion of the 1920s and 1930s also established crucial infrastructure that would later support the expansion of national fast food chains. These independent operators proved that hamburger demand existed in markets large and small, developed customer service techniques that could be systematized, and created a workforce experienced in fast food preparation that would become essential as the industry evolved toward corporate management. By the end of the 1930s, the roadside hamburger stand had become as distinctly American as jazz music or baseball, representing entrepreneurial opportunity, cultural informality, and the democratic ideal that good food should be accessible to everyone, regardless of social status or geographic location. The hamburger had found its perfect cultural moment, just in time to help feed a nation that was about to face its greatest challenges and celebrate its most significant victories. The late 1930s and 1940s brought challenges that nobody could have predicted and opportunities that nobody could have planned. As America faced economic hardship followed by global war, the hamburger found itself serving a role that went far beyond simple convenience food. It became a symbol of resilience, a source of affordable nutrition during tough times, and eventually, a taste of home for families learning to cope with unprecedented changes in how they lived, worked, and ate. The Great Depression forced millions of American families to reconsider everything about their relationship with food. Restaurant dining became a luxury most couldn't afford, but the need for quick, satisfying, economical meals became more urgent than ever. Hamburgers, with their combination of protein, carbohydrates, and relatively low cost, emerged as a practical solution for families stretching every dollar while still trying to provide substantial nutrition. What's fascinating about this period is how economic necessity drove culinary innovation in directions that would permanently change American home cooking. Families who had never considered making hamburgers at home suddenly found themselves experimenting with ground beef as a way to make meat portions stretch further while still feeling like they were serving real meals to their children and working spouses. Contemporary cookbooks from the late 1930s reveal a dramatic shift in how hamburgers were presented to home cooks. Earlier recipe collections had treated them as casual snacks or novelty items, but Depression-era publications began featuring hamburgers as legitimate dinner options, complete with suggestions for side dishes, nutritional information, and techniques for making small amounts of ground beef feed larger families. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for hamburgers to make this transition from restaurant food to family staple. Ground beef was generally less expensive than other cuts. It cooked quickly on stovetops that most families already owned. It could be seasoned and prepared in countless variations to prevent meal monotony, and children actually enjoyed eating it, solving the perpetual parental challenge of getting kids to consume adequate protein. I find it remarkable how quickly American families adapted hamburger preparation to their own kitchen capabilities and family preferences. Some households developed signature seasoning blends passed down through generations. Others created elaborate side dish combinations that turned simple hamburgers into complete family dinners. Many families established hamburger nights as regular weekly traditions that provided both nutritional value and anticipatory excitement for children. Food historians have noted that this period represents the true democratization of hamburger culture, as families across all economic levels discovered that hamburgers could be prepared successfully in home kitchens without special equipment or professional cooking skills. The hamburger became perhaps the first restaurant food that ordinary families could replicate at home with results that satisfied both adults and children. Here's the detail that often gets overlooked in Depression-era food histories. Many families began experimenting with hamburger extenders, adding breadcrumbs, vegetables, or other ingredients to make ground beef portions stretch further while maintaining satisfying meal volume. These innovations, born from economic necessity, actually improved the texture and flavor of many home-prepared hamburgers, creating cooking techniques that would persist long after the economic pressures had passed. The war years brought entirely new challenges, as meat rationing forced families to treat ground beef as a precious commodity that needed to be used wisely and stretched creatively. Rationing stamps and point systems meant that hamburgers became special occasion foods, planned and anticipated rather than casually consumed, which paradoxically increased their emotional significance within family dining culture. Contemporary wartime cooking advice emphasized techniques for making hamburgers more nutritious and filling with minimal meat content. Government nutrition programs promoted hamburgers as efficient protein delivery systems that could support the health of defense workers and growing children. The hamburger was officially recognized as a valuable component of the American wartime diet, receiving government endorsement that elevated its status from casual snack to nutritional necessity. What strikes me as most poignant about this period is how hamburgers became associated with family togetherness and home front morale during a time when so many families were separated by military service or defense work. Letters between family members often mentioned looking forward to sharing hamburgers together when the war ended, suggesting that this simple food had become emotionally connected to hopes for family reunion and normal life restoration. Scholars continue to debate whether the wartime experience fundamentally changed American attitudes toward convenience foods and home cooking, with some arguing that rationing and defense work created lasting preferences for quick meal preparation, while others contend that wartime cooking actually strengthened traditional home cooking skills and family meal traditions that would persist into the post-war era. The wartime rationing experience also inadvertently created a generation of home cooks who became experts at maximizing flavor and nutrition from limited hamburger portions. These skills would prove valuable during the post-war suburban expansion, when families wanted to maintain wartime frugality while enjoying increased prosperity, creating demand for foods that felt both economical and celebratory. By 1945, hamburgers had completed their transformation from street food curiosity to essential element of American family dining. They had proven their versatility during economic hardship, demonstrated their emotional significance during family separation, and established themselves as foods that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental appeal to both adults and children. The wartime experience had also created unprecedented numbers of Americans who were skilled at preparing hamburgers in home kitchens, using techniques developed under challenging circumstances that would later be applied to more abundant conditions. When prosperity returned, these families would bring their hamburger expertise to suburban kitchens equipped with modern appliances and backyard grilling equipment, setting the stage for the next great chapter in American hamburger culture. What emerges from this period is a sense of hamburgers earning their place in American family life through genuine utility rather than marketing or cultural promotion. They had helped families maintain dignity during economic hardship, provided comfort during wartime uncertainty, and created shared experiences that strengthened family bonds during challenging times, proving that sometimes the most important cultural developments happen not through grand gestures, but through simple foods that meet genuine human needs with reliability, affordability, and surprising emotional resonance. The 1950s arrived with a burst of optimism, prosperity, and an entirely new way of thinking about what American life could be. As families moved to expanding suburbs, equipped their new homes with modern appliances, and embraced the promise of leisure time that previous generations could never have imagined, the hamburger was about to undergo its most dramatic transformation yet. This time, it wasn't about survival or necessity. It was about celebration, convenience, and the pursuit of the perfect American dream meal. Ray Kroc wasn't looking to revolutionize American dining when he first encountered the McDonald Brothers operation in San Bernardino, California in 1954. He was a milkshake machine salesman, curious about why a single restaurant needed 8 of his multi-mixers. What he discovered was a food service system so efficient and profitable that it would reshape not just hamburger culture, but the entire concept of how Americans would eat for generations to come. Richard and Maurice McDonald had been quietly perfecting what they called the Speedy system since 1948, a radically simplified approach to restaurant operations that eliminated everything except the most popular menu items, standardized every aspect of food preparation, and reduced service time to unprecedented levels. Their hamburgers, French fries, and beverages could be prepared, packaged, and delivered with assembly line efficiency that made White Castle's earlier innovations seem almost quaint by comparison. What Kroc recognized, and what would make him wealthy beyond imagination, was that the McDonald brothers had solved the fundamental challenge of restaurant franchising. They had created a system so detailed and standardized that it could be replicated anywhere, by anyone, with identical results. Every hamburger would be the same size, cooked for the same amount of time, assembled in the same sequence, and served with the same efficiency, regardless of location or individual employee capabilities. The McDonald's franchise system that emerged in the mid-1950s represented something unprecedented in American business, a way to scale successful food service operations across vast distances while maintaining complete quality control. Kroc's genius wasn't just recognizing the potential, but creating the training programs, supplier relationships, and operational standards that would make nationwide consistency achievable rather than merely theoretical. Here's what strikes me as revolutionary about the McDonald's approach. They understood that Americans were becoming increasingly mobile, moving between cities for work and pleasure, and that consistency had become more valuable than local variation. A family traveling from Chicago to Los Angeles could stop at any McDonald's along the way and know exactly what they would receive, how much it would cost, and how quickly they would be served. It was predictability as a business model. Food historians have noted that McDonald's success wasn't just about better hamburgers or even faster service, though they excelled at both. The real innovation was creating a dining experience that felt both familiar and special, casual enough for everyday meals, but standardized enough to feel like a small celebration. McDonald's made restaurant dining accessible to families who might have felt intimidated by traditional establishments, while maintaining quality standards that satisfied more sophisticated customers. The expansion of McDonald's throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s demonstrated something remarkable about American consumer preferences. Given the choice between local restaurants with variable quality and limited hours, or a standardized chain that guaranteed consistency, speed, and reasonable prices, American families increasingly chose predictability. McDonald's wasn't just selling hamburgers. They were selling reliability in an increasingly complex world. What's fascinating about this period is how McDonald's managed to make mass production feel personal through clever design and marketing choices. The Golden Arches architecture was instantly recognizable. The red and white color scheme felt cheerful and welcoming, and the emphasis on cleanliness and efficiency appealed to suburban families who valued these qualities in their own homes. McDonald's had figured out how to make corporate standardization feel like hometown hospitality. I find it remarkable how quickly McDonald's became embedded in American family culture, becoming the destination for birthday celebrations, after-game meals, and casual family outings that required no advanced planning or special preparation. They had created a new category of dining experience, somewhere between home cooking and restaurant dining, that met needs that families didn't even realize they had until McDonald's existed to fulfill them. The McDonald's phenomenon also solved practical problems for increasingly busy American families. Parents could feed their children quickly and predictably, without cooking, cleaning, or worrying about whether the kids would actually eat what was served. McDonald's had essentially created a form of outsourced family dining that allowed parents to provide restaurant experiences without restaurant complexity, expense, or time investment. Scholars continue to debate whether McDonald's success represented the triumph of efficiency and convenience over culinary tradition and local culture, or whether it simply gave American families exactly what they wanted and needed during a period of rapid social and economic change. What's undisputed is that McDonald's proved the commercial viability of systematized fast food on a scale that had never been attempted before. Here's the detail that often gets overlooked in McDonald's histories. Their success created a template that dozens of other entrepreneurs would attempt to replicate, leading to the explosion of fast food chains throughout the 1960s and beyond. McDonald's didn't just become successful. They created an entire industry category that would employ millions of Americans and fundamentally alter dining patterns across the country. The McDonald's revolution also represented a crucial shift in how Americans thought about hamburgers. From street food curiosity to family staple to corporate product, the hamburger had traveled an extraordinary cultural journey in less than a century. McDonald's completion of this transformation, turning hamburgers into the foundation of America's first truly national food service empire, marked the moment when this simple sandwich officially became the most recognizable symbol of American dining culture. By 1960, McDonald's had demonstrated that hamburgers could support not just restaurants or regional chains, but massive corporate enterprises with systematic operations spanning the entire continent. Ray Kroc had taken the McDonald brothers' local innovation and scaled it into something approaching a cultural institution, proving that the right system could turn hamburgers into the basis for one of America's most successful business stories, and one of its most enduring cultural exports. As the 1950s melted into the 1960s, something magical was happening in American backyards across the country. Suburban families, armed with new prosperity, leisure time, and an almost religious devotion to the perfect lawn, were discovering that hamburgers tasted different when cooked outdoors, shared with neighbors, and accompanied by the lazy rituals of weekend relaxation. The backyard barbecue wasn't just changing how Americans cooked hamburgers, it was transforming them into symbols of everything the post-war generation hoped to achieve. The suburban expansion of the 1950s and 1960s created millions of new homes, each equipped with something previous generations could barely imagine: a private outdoor space dedicated entirely to leisure and entertaining. These weren't working farms or practical gardens. They were landscapes designed for pleasure, complete with patios, lawn furniture, and increasingly, outdoor cooking equipment that would turn weekend meal preparation into a form of entertainment. What's remarkable about this period is how quickly outdoor grilling evolved from occasional novelty to essential suburban ritual. Contemporary home and garden magazines from the early 1960s describe backyard barbecuing as practically mandatory for proper suburban living, with detailed articles about equipment selection, menu planning, and social protocols for neighborhood cookouts that would maximize both culinary success and social status. The hamburger proved perfectly suited to this new outdoor cooking culture. Unlike steaks or roasts that required significant culinary skill, hamburgers were forgiving, flexible, and appealing to both adults and children. A suburban father could master hamburger grilling relatively quickly, serve food that satisfied his entire family, and demonstrate his competence as both provider and entertainer without requiring professional cooking training. Here's what strikes me as particularly clever about how hamburgers adapted to backyard culture. They became infinitely customizable, allowing families to accommodate different tastes and preferences within a single meal. Children could have plain hamburgers, adults could experiment with elaborate toppings, and everyone could participate in the meal preparation without requiring advanced cooking skills or expensive ingredients. Food historians have noted that backyard hamburger grilling created entirely new social patterns around American family dining. The traditional formal dinner, with its emphasis on proper table setting and careful service, gave way to casual outdoor meals where children could play while adults cooked, where neighbors might spontaneously join the gathering, and where the emphasis shifted from culinary sophistication to social connection and relaxed enjoyment. The equipment industry quickly recognized the commercial potential of suburban grilling culture. Manufacturers developed increasingly sophisticated outdoor cooking systems, from simple portable grills to elaborate permanent installations that transformed backyard cooking from occasional activity to serious hobby. The hamburger had created a market for outdoor cooking equipment that would eventually become a multi-billion-dollar industry. What's fascinating about this period is how backyard hamburger culture reinforced idealized visions of American family life that were being promoted through television, magazines, and popular culture. The image of a father grilling hamburgers while children played nearby and mothers prepared side dishes became a visual shorthand for post-war prosperity, family togetherness, and the successful achievement of middle-class American dreams. I find it remarkable how the backyard barbecue democratized outdoor cooking in ways that traditional outdoor dining never had. Unlike camping or picnicking, which required special skills and equipment, backyard grilling allowed ordinary suburban families to enjoy outdoor dining with all the conveniences of modern kitchen facilities nearby. It was adventure with safety nets, exploration with familiar comforts, perfectly suited to the suburban mindset. The regional variations that emerged during this period reveal fascinating insights into how different parts of the country adapted hamburger grilling to local tastes and traditions. Southern families often incorporated regional barbecue techniques and seasonings. West Coast grillers experimented with fresh vegetables and health-conscious preparations. Midwestern cooks focused on hearty portions and traditional accompaniments. Each region was essentially creating its own hamburger grilling subculture within the broader American phenomenon. Contemporary social observers noted that backyard hamburger cookouts were creating new forms of neighborhood social interaction. These weren't formal dinner parties with elaborate planning and social obligations, but casual gatherings that could develop spontaneously and include whoever happened to be available. The hamburger had enabled a more democratic form of entertaining that matched the informal social style of suburban communities. Scholars continue to debate whether the backyard barbecue era represented the peak of American family-centered culture or simply a temporary idealization that masked more complex social and economic changes happening throughout the country. What's clear is that hamburger grilling became deeply embedded in American family traditions, creating memories and rituals that would influence generations of suburban families. Here's the detail that often gets overlooked in backyard barbecue histories. Many families developed elaborate hamburger grilling traditions that were passed down from fathers to children, creating informal apprenticeship systems where grilling techniques, seasoning preferences, and social protocols were transmitted through hands-on participation rather than formal instruction. The hamburger was becoming a vehicle for family bonding and cultural transmission. The backyard barbecue era also established hamburgers as the unofficial food of American leisure and celebration. Birthday parties, graduation celebrations, neighborhood gatherings, holiday cookouts. All of these events increasingly featured hamburgers as central elements, not because they were the most sophisticated option available, but because they represented relaxation, enjoyment, and the kind of unpretentious pleasure that suburban families wanted to associate with their most positive family memories. By the late 1960s, the backyard hamburger had achieved something extraordinary in American culture. It had become simultaneously ordinary and special, everyday food that could also serve as celebration cuisine, simple preparation that created complex social experiences, and individual meals that somehow represented collective values about family, community, and the American way of life. The suburbanization of hamburger culture had completed a journey that began with German immigrants and street vendors, traveled through lunch wagons and roadside stands, survived economic hardship and global war, and finally arrived at the perfectly manicured lawns and outdoor grills of post-war America, where this simple sandwich had somehow become the edible embodiment of everything a generation hoped to achieve through hard work, prosperity, and the pursuit of happiness in carefully planned communities designed around the promise that ordinary families could live extraordinary lives. What emerges from this backyard barbecue era is a sense of hamburgers finally finding their perfect cultural home, not in restaurants or commercial establishments, but in the private outdoor spaces where American families gathered to celebrate their prosperity, strengthen their relationships, and create the kind of memories that would define suburban childhood for generations, one perfectly grilled hamburger at a time, served with potato salad, cold beverages, and the satisfied knowledge that this was exactly what the American dream was supposed to taste like. And so, as we reach the end of this gentle journey through hamburger history, you've witnessed something quite extraordinary. A simple combination of ground beef and bread, born from practical necessity and immigrant traditions, somehow managed to weave itself so completely into the fabric of American life that it became more than food. It became a story about who we are, how we adapt, and what happens when ordinary things find their way into the center of our most cherished memories. From those first mysterious German connections in the 1800s, through lunch wagons serving busy workers, past the roadside stands that fed a nation on wheels, through economic hardship and global conflict, into corporate boardrooms and suburban backyards, the hamburger has been there for every chapter of the American experience, quietly adapting, persistently satisfying, and somehow always managing to taste like home, no matter how far from home we might be. What strikes me most about this story is how it mirrors our own human journey through changing times. The hamburger succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was genuine, not because it promised everything, but because it delivered exactly what people needed, when they needed it most, with a reliability that feels almost like friendship. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let your mind drift like the smoke from 1,000 backyard grills, carrying with it the satisfied contentment of families gathered around simple meals. The quiet pride of immigrants building new lives one recipe at a time. The resilience of communities that found ways to celebrate even during difficult times, and the gentle wisdom that sometimes. The most important stories are hidden in the most ordinary places. Close your eyes, and perhaps you can almost smell that familiar aroma, the one that means Saturday afternoon, childhood birthday parties, neighborhood cookouts where everyone was welcome, and the countless small moments when someone said, "Let's just get hamburgers," and somehow that simple suggestion made everything feel easier, more manageable, more like the life we hope to live. Feel your breathing slow as you imagine all those millions of hamburgers, grilled with care, shared with love, eaten with gratitude, each one carrying forward this unlikely story of how German seasoning techniques, American industrial innovation, immigrant entrepreneurship, and suburban dreams could somehow combine into something that tastes like belonging, feels like tradition, and reminds us that the best cultural treasures often come wrapped in the most humble packages. Let your thoughts grow as soft and warm as a perfectly toasted bun, as gentle as the conversations that happen around family dinner tables, as peaceful as weekend afternoons when time moves slowly. And the only important decision is whether you want cheese on that. The hamburger's journey is complete, but your journey toward rest, toward dreams, toward the quiet satisfaction of stories well told, is just beginning. Rest now, knowing that somewhere, in kitchens and backyards across America, the story continues, one hamburger at a time, one family gathering at a moment, one satisfied customer, one cherished memory. The simple sandwich that started as a practical solution to hunger has become a permanent ingredient in the recipe for American happiness, and that, perhaps, is the most delicious legacy of all. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as satisfying, as reliable, and as comforting as the very first bite of the very best hamburger you've ever tasted.